At this point, we now turn to one of the most pivotal moments in ancient Greek history, which are the wars that they fought against the Persians. The entire period of the war against the Persians was from 493 BC all the way down to 466 BC, and there were several stages that went ahead with in the conflicts between the Greeks and the Persians. We're going to focus here, however, on just the particular salient moments midway through this war period that ended up helping the Athenians to be catapulted into the high political position that they needed to be in order to germinate Old Comedy and Aristophanes' plays. So the first thing to know is that the Athenians, as we talked about before, had that close affinity with the Ionian cities on the east coast of the Aegean Sea or the west coast of Asia Minor, notably Miletus and Ephesus. Now, historically, the Persians had occupied the area much further east around Iran and Iraq, and had gradually made their way westward into Asia Minor. In 546 BC, the Persians successfully overthrew the city of Sardis, about 3/4 of the way over toward the west. They essentially undid the Lydian kingdom that had been ruled by the notoriously wealthy king Croesus. That was under the Persians' probably greatest historical leader, Cyrus, often known to us today as Cyrus the Great. As the Persians expanded westward, they came into contact with both the Greeks along the west coast of Asia Minor and also Egyptians eventually down to their southwest. And in fact, a successor to Cyrus, Cambyses, ended up from 525 to 522 BC incorporating Egypt also into Persian rule for that time. So now we have the Persians essentially encroaching gradually upon the Greek cities along the coast. And the arrangement the Persians eventually reached over time with those cities was not, in fact, to conquer them, or at least to try to conquer them, but instead to have Persian representatives in the governments of those cities, and for there, of course, to be taxation from those cities. For a time, the cities acquiesced. However, in 499 BC, there was an upheaval, a disturbance, at the city of Miletus. There was a leader named Aristagoras, who was actually a deputy tyrant in Miletus, who attempted an invasion of one of the islands out in the Aegean Sea, which you can find on your map, called Naxos. If you find it, you'll see that it's a fairly large island, quite wealthy and relatively well fortified there. So Aristagoras attempted a siege of the island, which failed. And so his reputation went down, obviously, in Miletus. So to distract everyone from the failed siege, he organized a coalition, probably not very well put together, of other neighboring cities and eventually a lot of the Ionian cities to rebel against Persian rule, 499 BC. And so this originates at Miletus, but comes to include many of the other major cities up and down the Ionian coast. Opinions differ as to whether this was a wise idea or not. It's possible that it could have worked, but one of the principal difficulties was that most of these cities really did not get along very well with each other and tended to be involved a lot of the time in one-upmanship, essentially, politically. And so Miletus, which is supposed to take control of this rebellion, finds itself very hard put to get the other cities to cooperate with it. So this rebellion, known to us as the Ionian Rebellion, lasts for 5 years, from 499 to 494 BC. Now, along the way, the Milesians secured an alliance with Athens to support it against the rebellion. The Persians became aware of this and knew that if they could overcome this Ionian revolt, that Athens would probably have to be punished next, because they had been a direct party in the revolt. 494 BC, the city of Miletus is defeated first at sea in a battle called Lade, L-A-D-E, and then on land. And the Persians move in, take over the city of Miletus, and destroy it. The Athenians were so horrified by this that they actually had a tragedy put on the following year called The Fall of Miletus by a tragic playwright named Phrynichus. And it so struck to the soul of the Athenian audience that they left crying in tears and actually ended up fining the playwright Phrynichus for having put on a play that disturbed them so and failed to pay proper homage to the gods, as was supposed to occur at a religious festival like the tragic competition. So in any event, the Athenians now became target number one for the Persians once they learned that the Athenians had provided direct support for the Milesians to essentially commit perfidy against the Persians. So the following year, 493 BC, Darius, the current king of Persia, organized a massive fleet and army combination to invade into Greece. First, he established a base out at Naxos, ironically, that same island, in 493 down to 492 BC. And then in 490 BC, he landed northeast of Athens, you can find it on your map, at Marathon. Marathon, although it's a city, also refers to the plain right outside of Athens itself and extending northeast. It's so called, interestingly, not because of a road race, but rather because of a shrub that used to grow there. But what did happen was that somebody spotted the Persians coming in and ran 26 miles to Athens, and that's in fact where the term comes from. So he warned the Athenians that the Persians were invading. The Athenians then dispatched somebody else named Phidippides to run all the way down, a good couple of hundred miles, down to the Spartans to try to get their help. The guy, Phidippides, ran all the way down and came into the Spartan government when he finally got down there, absolutely exhausted and probably panting for breath, told the Spartans what was happening. And in some versions, he actually died at that point. The Spartans, however, were observing a festival of the full moon and refused to provide any assistance to the Athenians. And in fact, neither did anybody else, with one exception. The city called, here it is, Plataea, which is right outside of Thebes, but is an ally of Athens. That's going to turn out to be a problem in their own later history. But the Plataeans did, in fact, offer support for the Athenians, but no one else did. So there now came to be a problem for the Athenians, because they really were not entirely certain that they could securely hold the city against this massive armada of the Persians coming in. And so the head general of the 10 generals was named Miltiades. He is in fact the father of a later prominent Athenian general named Cimon, and he's also related to the later historian Thucydides, and probably also the later politician named Thucydides as well. Big family. So Miltiades managed to persuade the Polemarchus, whose name is Callimachus. Polemarchus is the position of archon, one of those 9 archons, that is in charge of war affairs. So the Polemarchus was in a position at this point of deciding whether or not to carry out a campaign against the Persians or to surrender the city to them, because the 10 generals were in a 5-5 tie as to what to do. So Miltiades manages to persuade Callimachus to vote in favor of carrying out a campaign. It is agreed to do so, and the campaign is organized. We do not know its exact details, but it's possible that it was a kind of little bighorn campaign of essentially scaring the Persians into thinking that there was a much larger army than there in fact was. In any event, the Athenians were able to lure the Persians further inland into a trap and then ambush them, and were able, to everybody's shock, including the Persians, to defeat them. Whereupon Darius withdrew the land army and sailed away. Now Darius wanted badly vengeance for that defeat, but he got distracted with other Persian affairs down to 486 BC and was eventually carried away by an illness. And so Darius's reign turned over to his son Xerxes. Now Xerxes very definitely wanted vengeance for his father. So in 480 BC, Xerxes organized a second campaign, a much larger one, probably several hundreds of thousands of people, which was pretty enormous. We have the inflated figure 5 million given to us by Herodotus, and that's probably way too high. But there was some number like several hundreds of thousands is possible, and there were 1,200 ships. That's denoted to us by the tragic playwright Aeschylus in his play Persian that describes the outcome of the second Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. So the Persians came around northern Greece, the northern Aegean Sea, and they came down in two groups. We have a land group over here and a sea group over here. The Athenians and the Spartans, for once, were able to put aside their differences, and they teamed up for the Spartans to go and hold off the Persians at a place called Thermopylae, which you may have heard of from the movie 300, while the Athenians over here are trying to hold off the Persians at a place called Artemisium, which is at the northern tip of the island of Euboea. You can find both Thermopylae and Artemisium on your map. As you probably may know from the movie, or perhaps have heard of, the Spartans tried very hard, greatly outnumbered by the Persians, to hold off one slam by the Persians against the other, and were able to destroy many of the Persians and hold them off for a long time, even though they were numbered only 300. However, in time, the Persians were informed by a traitor from the Greek side about a pass going around Thermopylae, and eventually the Persians were able to circumvent the Spartans by going around this way, and the Persians on one side and the Persians on the other side eventually caught the Spartans in a vice. And with that, Thermopylae fell. Word got over to the Athenians, who were probably being bested by the Persians at sea, and in time the Athenians also surrendered. So as a result, these two areas fell apart. The Persians proceeded further south. Unfortunately for the Athenians, the Thebans to their northwest Medized, and there was really nobody else except possibly the Phocaeans who didn't agree with the Thebans to try to hold off the Persians, but the Phocaeans were much too weak. The Spartans were supported by Arcadians, but they also weren't really strong enough to really hold off the Persians either, and so the Athenians were left defenseless. So the Athenians were ruled, however, by a very, very crafty naval commander named Themistocles, one of the 10 generals. Themistocles was crafty enough to realize that if the Athenians could not hold their fleet at Artemisium successfully, there probably were Greeks on board the ships who could be persuaded to turn against the Persians when time came about, because there were probably a lot of Ionians who were in servitude to the Persians. So Themistocles arranged for a message to be scrawled on a rock right near Artemisium that the Greeks saw as the Persian ships sailed further south. And it was basically one saying, "We know you're there, get ready." And all of a sudden the Ionian Greeks realized that they had allies elsewhere. And then Themistocles put forward a petition to the Athenian assembly to be prepared to evacuate the city, to take all the leading Athenian citizens out of Athens over to Salamis, the island, and to Troisdon around the corner from the Gulf, and to essentially allow the Persians to come in and sack the city. This interestingly happened twice in this period, but this is the first of the two occasions. When that happened, and especially when the Persians came down so quickly through Boeotia, forcing the Athenians to accelerate that decision from that decree, then Themistocles sent word to Xerxes, the Persian king, that in fact all of the Athenian ships were crammed near Salamis, and if the Persians could come around and catch them, that the Persians would be able to vanquish the fleet and get control of Athens. It was a trick, and it worked. Turned out that Xerxes didn't know the important rule in war, which is do not trust your opponent. So Xerxes indeed brought his heavier Persian ships around the Gulf of Athens and into the portion of, let's do it this way. There we go, this way. Nope. I can't do directions. Anyway, brought the Persian ships around into the Battle of Salamis itself. And in doing so, there it is. Now I got it. From here to here. So if you imagine Salamis here, the Persians are coming in this way, and the Athenians are, here we go, coming in this way, and the Athenians are all around the island. When the Athenians saw the Persians coming in too far, the Athenians immediately sent word back and forth from Troisdon to Salamis to Athens itself with beacon fires. And according to Aeschylus's Persians, there was a big outcry saying, go after the enemy as fast as possible. This is the day in which we must determine freedom for Greeks from tyranny and oppression. And so the Athenians came in and quickly caught the Persians off guard and vanquished the ships. As a result, the Athenians defeated the Persian fleet again to everyone's shock. The Battle of Salamis, 480 BC, and the Persians fled. Now, that wasn't unfortunately the end of the story, though, because although the sea fleet was defeated, there was still the land army. And when Xerxes left, he committed his remaining land forces to his general Mardonius. Mardonius, the following year, 479 BC, landed in Boeotia and sent word to the Athenians that if the Athenians did not surrender the city willingly, that they would come in. So the Athenians sent word to the Spartans to try to get help, and once again the Spartans refused to come and help for the same reason as before, the full moon festival. So the Athenians essentially wrote back to Mardonius, refusing to get any to surrender in any way to the Persians. They instead committed to battle. So Mardonius first of all, did manage to send a land force down to catch Athens, and once again, as before, the Athenians evacuated and allowed the Persians to take over the entire empty city. In the midst of that, the Athenians finally persuaded the Spartans, maybe at the termination of the festival, to come up. The Spartans moved up north, and they situated themselves near Plataea, and the Persians came around also to try to hold them off. There was some kind of maneuvering going on between the two that's described to us by Herodotus, and in the end, the Persians ended up making an error in where they moved, and the Spartans unexpectedly had an opportunity to go after the Persians, and in another very surprising battle near Plataea, the Persian land army was vanquished. As it happens, the Athenians also chased the Persian fleet from west to east and caught the Persian fleet at a place called Mycale, which is right near Ephesus, and defeated them there, allegedly on the same day as the Battle of Plataea. As a consequence of all of these victories by the Greeks, the Persians were repeatedly done in. First Darius and then Xerxes were defeated by the Athenians. In the case of Xerxes, by the very clever and determined leadership of the great Athenian hero, Themistocles. So what this does is to secure the Athenians' prominence in Greek politics in a way that, despite the great service they had done to the Greek world by assisting to rid the Greeks of this enemy, would result in a lot of frayed relations between the Athenians and the other Greeks, as the Athenians get very big on themselves, thinking that they're entitled to a lot more power than in fact was thought to be the case by the other Greeks. So there's the Persian Wars, and I do want to mention that the Battle of Marathon is important in Aristophanes' play Wasps, because the protagonist Procleon or Philocleon, depending on your translation, this elderly man, is in fact a veteran from Marathon, and many of the jurors on the juries in the Heliaea courts established by Pericles were elderly men, and many of whom probably, even some years later, may very well have served at Marathon. Okay, so in our next video, we will start moving down into the 5th century BC, the full classical period, in which we now start to talk about the effects of Athenian democracy on the rest of the Greek world, and what their victory in the Persians did for their own power status. We will see you next video.